Our speaker this morning, as you know, and I think many of you know him, is Professor Edgar Willis, who is Emeritus Professor of Speech, Communications, and Theater here at Michigan. He's been on the faculty for quite some time. Actually, he joined Michigan's faculty in 1952, and as most of you know, he was chairman of the Speech, Communication, and Theater Department from 1969 through 1979. He's a native of Canada. His academic career includes bachelor's and master's degrees from Wayne State University and his doctorate from the University of Wisconsin. He has worked in radio in the past. During his period here at Michigan, he was for a time a news analyst for TV Channel 4 in Detroit. He's written 5 books on broadcasting, and the 6th, my notes from last year indicate, was about to be published, and I think may well be published at this point. But many of you know him from our Stratford trips. Indeed, Professor Willis just accompanied our Stratford tour, which took in 2 Shakespearean plays, Hamlet and Much Ado About Nothing. You heard his seminars there on those. He's been a regular speaker at U of M clubs across the country, and he also, this summer, is making his 4th appearance, I believe it is, with Alumni University. So here to talk today about who really wrote the Shakespeare plays, Professor Edgar Willis.
Those of you who have gone to Stratford know why I mount the throne before I begin speaking. Can you hear me? I wanted to say a few incidental things just to check to make sure you can hear me. The reason is that I have, as a lot of people do, a back problem. And to stand for an hour and a half or 2 hours would completely do me in. So although this is not what I would choose, I would much rather stand. It turns out that it's not possible for me. When Joel mentioned that I was born in Canada, it reminded me that our former president, Harold Shapiro, and I had 2 things in common. He was born in Canada, and we both have twin siblings. His happens to be a boy, mine happens to be a girl. But when I ran into Harold, we always had something to talk about. We talked about our twins, we talked about Canada. We didn't really talk about much else. So I had very little impact on the policies of the university during his administration. I was also reminded when I went down the hall that I was glad that I had refreshed my mind on Latin again to avoid getting into the wrong restroom. During the last decade of the 16th century and the first decade of the 17th century, a group of poems and plays were written that are generally seen as supreme literary masterpieces. It gave the name of the person attached to those plays recognition in many countries of the world as the greatest writer of all time. His plays were produced in London during his lifetime a great deal, and down through the 400 or so years that have passed since, they are continually being produced all around the world. And as Joel said, some of us together saw Much Ado About Nothing and Hamlet just a few weeks ago in Stratford, Canada. The verdict that Shakespeare, the supposed writer of these plays, is the greatest writer of all time is not just limited to English-speaking countries. Germany took him so much to heart that they called him our Shakespeare, Unser Shakespeare. And I've heard, although it's difficult to believe, and perhaps some of you who read German could talk about this, that the plays in German are equally great masterpieces, and some have even said that in German they're even better. In the Soviet Union, Shakespeare is the preeminent writer among the Soviet people except for Russian writers. And he is even read and produced in China. Throughout the world, Shakespeare's works have received more translations than any other work except the Bible. This towering reputation is based on two narrative poems, Venus and Adonis, The Rape of Lucrece, 154 sonnets that are unsurpassed in their craftsmanship, some 37 plays in which the author told wonderful stories, created characters of such depth and richness that they exist in our minds as real people. And he wrote passage after passage of such transcendent brilliance that it absolutely takes your breath away. And when you read one of these passages, as I have on many occasions thought, it couldn't possibly have been said better. And I think that many of you have had the same reaction. He has enriched our language with from 3,000 to 5,000 new words. Among them, he was the first to use these words: barefaced, disgraceful, fretful, inauspicious. He invented expressions so felicitous that they have become part of our language. We use such phrases as elbow room, catching a cold, foregone conclusion, mind's eye, flaming youth, without realizing that Shakespeare first wrote them. The fact that these lines have become part of our general usage reminds me of a terrible, awful joke, which I hope you will excuse me for telling. Man and wife were going on a trip, and the man asked the wife to check what seats they had on the airplane. And she looked and she said, "Well, it's a little smudge. I can't tell whether it's 2C or 2B. And he said in irritation, "Well, what is it, to be or not to be?" Shakespeare's works take up more space in Bartlett's familiar quotations than any other writers. And that is another indication that he is our greatest writer. I suppose I should note that the admiration for Shakespeare is not completely universal. George Bernard Shaw tended to think that he was a better writer than Shakespeare. He didn't agree with Ben Jonson's rhapsodic statement, "He was not of an age, but for all time." Shaw modified it to, "Shakespeare is for an afternoon, but not for all time." Those who went to Stratford will please excuse me for telling this next one because they heard it there, but to indicate how common his phrases and words have become, a lady went to see Hamlet for the first time, and she said, "Well, I don't know what all the fuss is about. All Shakespeare did was to string together a lot of quotations." Well, most people do respect and admire Shakespeare tremendously. I don't know whether we would go as far as the poet Swinburne did when he said, "It would be better to lose all other works and keep Shakespeare than to lose what he had written and keep the rest." That is going pretty far. But there is general acceptance, I think, that in the English language at least, Shakespeare is the greatest literary genius we have ever had. Conventional scholars believe that the person who wrote the Shakespeare works was born in Stratford, England in 1564. He lived for many years in London. He earned his living as an actor, as a shareholder in the theater. He returned to Stratford about 1612, and he died 4 years later in April of 1916 at the age of 52. There are some who doubt that the person who was born and brought up in Stratford, England, could possibly have produced the monumental works that we recognize as the Shakespeare plays and poems. And this particular controversy has provoked countless books and articles. In 1947, one investigator counted 4,000 publications dealing with this authorship controversy, and these articles continue to pour out. Perhaps some of you saw in the New Yorker, one of the issues of 1988, a very long article which dealt with, as the article was titled, the authorship question. Who really wrote the Shakespeare plays? I don't propose this morning to provide an absolute answer to that question, and I hope that doesn't disappoint you. But what I am going to do is to present the arguments on both sides of this question, and then you are free to draw your own conclusions. I suppose one of the questions we might ask is, why should we bother with this question at all? We have the works, isn't that enough? Well, I think for one thing, it's a fascinating literary puzzle. And further, shouldn't we try to ascertain the truth about the authorship of the greatest works ever produced in English? And I think there's an additional point also, and that is that establishing the identity of the author, if we can, we will learn more about the person, and I think thus come to a better understanding of what he wrote and why he wrote it. The first doubts about the Shakespeare authorship were expressed as early as 1781, but the present controversy dates back to about the middle of the 19th century, so that it has been going on for a period of about 150 years. Conventional scholars have tended to react to this question with scorn that it's being asked, and even more, in some cases, with sputtering rage. Sidney Lee called the claims for other people than Shakespeare as the author madhouse chatter, unworthy of serious attention, but professed students of intellectual aberration. And there are some conventional scholars, I think, who even refuse to consider the arguments because they consider them to be so ridiculous. They view the proponents of another author as an absolute heresy, that you're making a sacrilegious attack on somebody who has almost attained the status of a god. Well, rather than calling them heretics, I'm going to this morning call them anti-Stratfordians. And by that term, anti-Stratfordians, I mean the people who don't believe that the Shakespeare who was born in Stratford could possibly have written the plays. And then the people who do believe that, we'll call them the Stratfordians. I hope that that terminology will be clear to you. Well, what are the reasons why this question has risen? I think the major reason that's presented by the anti-Stratfordians is that it couldn't be possible for a person who was born in Stratford, in the kind of atmosphere and environment that existed in that little town during his young years, could possibly have written the plays that are now credited to him.